Singapore once bought the world's largest passenger jets when tourism barely existed, turned swamplands into factories when no one believed in Singaporean manufacturing, and bet on container ports before a single Asian shipping line even owned container ships. Today, a single failed bet like that would end political careers. Somewhere along the way, as we got richer, there was a shift in how we take our bets. And this shift could be exactly what trapped Singapore in stagnation, while other countries eat our lunch. So today, we'll go through the bets the leaders of our past dared to make, uncover what's changed in our strategy today,
I'm sorry, but we will try and do better the next time.
and what it would take to bring us to a new golden age. Before we begin, welcome to What Makes a Country. I'm Kian Chong, your host, and on this channel, we uncover the hidden architecture behind successful countries. Our focus is on the policies, institutions, and businesses that create lasting, thriving societies. So what were these bets that built modern Singapore? And why did they seem so crazy at the time? We can divide them across three distinct eras: the Lee Kuan Yew era, the Goh Chok Tong era, and the Hsien Loong era. Let's go through the four most important bets of each era. You can actually see how their strategies evolve with each generation of leadership. Let's start with the first bet of the Lee Kuan Yew era. Picture this, it's the 1960s, and the entire developing world is telling you that foreign multinational companies are colonial puppets. Indonesia under Sukarno was actively expelling Western companies, and Malaysia was doubling down on import substitution, trying to produce everything domestically rather than courting foreign firms. So what does Singapore do? We went out of the way to court them. Dr. Goh King Swee made a bold bet on courting multinational corporates to set up manufacturing here in Singapore. But the odds were stacked against him. Singapore had little manufacturing experience and no skilled workforce. But Dr. Goh understood deeply that the exploitation that other countries are afraid of also came with investment and training that no one else would provide. We were essentially betting on globalization before anyone called it that. No one thought that we would succeed in manufacturing exports, because Singapore was always known as a trading or financial hub. Dr. Goh's plans to build factories in swampy Jurong was initially termed as Goh's Folly Even. And the second bet was just as risky. In 1966, Singapore started building container ports. This was when ships were still loading and unloading cargo piece by piece in most ports around the world. Not a single shipping line in Asia had even committed to building container ships to move goods between Europe and the Far East. The containerization revolution was barely 5 years old at the time. Most port authorities around the world were still skeptical. Why invest billions in specialized equipment for a shipping method that might be a fad? But Howe Yun Chong saw the future and went against the advice of port experts, borrowed money from the World Bank, and led the construction of the container terminal. Financially, the move was not supported by even the World Bank, as they did not think that Singapore was ready for containerization yet, and made their loans contingent on the expansion of existing port facilities for conventional cargo at Keppel Harbour. The bet was enormous. Singapore's first container terminal cost around $200 million for a small country with a GDP of around $2 billion in 1966. This was like betting 10% of your entire economy on a new trend. And to add to that, Port Klang waited until 1973. Penang Port, our closest competitor, didn't start containerization until 1974, 8 years later. We were building infrastructure for a future that no one else could entirely predict. And if that wasn't entirely audacious enough, you got to hear the third bet. In 1972, JY Pillay bought the largest jumbo jets, the Boeing 747 for Singapore Airlines. Singapore was actually trying to nurture a local champion when tourism was still nascent and the business travel market was thin. To understand how crazy this was, Singapore Airlines had just been spun out from Malaysian Singapore Airlines and it was newly independent. The 747 cost around Singapore $60 million each, about 200 million in today's money. But JY Pillay had a vision. Singapore Airlines wouldn't just fly passengers, it would become the gold standard for Asian aviation. No other Southeast Asian airlines would purchase the 747 until almost a decade later. Thai Airways didn't get their first until 1981, 9 years later. Philippines Airlines waited until 1979. Even established carriers like British Airways and Air France were hesitant about the 747 economics. And to add to that, Singapore had no domestic markets to bail the airline out. Singapore haven't even begun its air hub strategy and was still operating out of Paya Lebar Airport. Countries like Britain and the US initially denied Singapore airline landing rights. Long-haul flights became tense government-to-government negotiations, often requiring top Singaporean diplomats and ministers to battle for landing rights in foreign capitals, facing protectionist pushback from countries wary of a rising Asian carrier. But the most radical experiment of all was still to come. Lee Kuan Yew decided to give every Singaporean a stake in a country through HDB public housing ownership. Such a radical and massive social housing experiment has never been tried anywhere else. Most other housing programs in the world, whether in Britain or Hong Kong, just built rental housing and called it a day. But Lee Kuan Yew understood something far deeper. Ownership creates loyalty. If people own their homes, they'll be willing to fight for their country. The numbers were actually staggering. Singapore committed to building 100,000 housing units in 5 years. That's one apartment every 26 minutes, 24 hours a day for 5 years straight. To put that in perspective, Singapore was attempting to build more public housing per capita than any other country in modern history. Dr. Goh engineered its success by linking CPF to HDBs to make it economically within the reach for the vast majority of the population. And Lim Kim San was the execution genius. When suppliers of sand and gravel began to form cartels among themselves to jack up prices, he developed his own granite and sand quarries to make sure that they knew that he meant business. All these bets were made with the backdrop of high unemployment and learning that we could no longer depend on the Malaysian hinterland or the British military to make a living, while having to spend up to 40% of the yearly budget in the early years on defense. The Lee Kuan Yew era proved that we could make the impossible work by taking high-risk, high-reward bets. With such a high standard set for Singaporean leadership, how did the Goh Chok Tong era keep up once the baton was passed over? Let's begin with the first bet. In 1990, Philip Yew proposed that Singapore stitch together 7 separate islands into a petrochemical hub. It was unfathomable to the petrochemical giants to invest. What Singapore was presenting at the time was akin to selling stretches of seawater, with only the promise of land sometime in the future. The total reclamation project would cost $7 billion and take over a decade to complete. The selling process was brutal. It took 3 whole years of presentation, site visits, and government guarantees, all before the first commitment came from Celanese Chemicals from the US in 1995. When the chairman and CEO of Teijin Polycarbonates, Hiroshi Itagaki, visited the site in December 1996, about 2/3 of it was still underwater. He was skeptical. Reclamation in Japan tended to be a slow and laborious process. But when he returned in 6 months' time, the entire site was completely reclaimed. The growing number of yeses and the stunning speed of reclamation has sparked a chain reaction that secured even more commitments. Oil giants soon had multi-billion commitments on Jurong Island. By 2010, Jurong Island hosted over 95 companies. Singapore had created one of the world's largest petrochemical hubs outside of the Middle East, on land that didn't even exist 20 years earlier. By concentrating the entire value chain in the petrochemical industry on one island, companies could share infrastructure, pipelines, and utilities. Waste from one plant became raw material for another. Singapore had created industrial symbiosis at unprecedented scale. But Philip Yew had even more ideas. His next target would challenge Singapore's very identity. His plan in the early 2000s to turn Singapore into a biomedical hub made sure that the biopolice was completed in double quick time to spearhead the entire effort. Instead of the usual 30 months to build a building of that scale, it was all done in 18. But the odds were stacked against Singapore. The idea was heavily debated because Singapore had no expertise in this arena. We didn't even have a steady pipeline of talent emerging from our universities ready to lead the biomedical effort. When Lee Kuan Yew asked Dr. Sidney Brenner, a Nobel Prize winner, why Singapore should invest in biomedical sciences and biotechnological infrastructure, noting that Singapore was a nation of technicians, he replied candidly that if you don't do something like this, Prime Minister, you will remain a nation of technicians. Philip Yew was betting that Singapore's small size could become actually an advantage, that the entire country could serve as a testbed for new medical breakthroughs and technologies, with regulatory fast-tracking. The scale of this bet was actually staggering. Singapore committed over $7 billion across a decade to build not just biopalace, but an entire ecosystem. They went out of their way to recruit star scientists from Harvard, MIT, and Cambridge with large packages. Dr. Hsien Loong left the National Cancer Institute in the US to head Singapore's Genome Institute. Alan Coleman, who helped to clone Dolly the sheep, moved to Singapore to lead stem cell research. And Singapore seeded thousands of students with scholarship dollars to nurture an ecosystem of local scientists that could learn from these leading scientists. But Philip Yew didn't just stop there. His next ambitious bet had the government leading the charge. When we realized how much value the semiconductor sector provided, Philip Yew attempted to create our own TSMC, called Chartered Semiconductors Manufacturing, or CSM. We started the same year as TSMC in 1987. TSMC had pioneered the pure-play foundry model, where they will manufacture chips for anyone. It is basically like contract manufacturing, where any startup which wants to manufacture chips no longer needs to raise billions of dollars to build their own chip factories first. That's how companies like Apple started manufacturing the iPhone without first building their own fabs. CSM replicated the foundry model that TSMC pioneered. But both TSMC and CSM were betting on a completely unproven business model at that time. The idea that companies would trust their most valuable intellectual property to third-party manufacturers was radical. It was unclear that it would actually work. Intel, the industry leader at the time, thought foundries were a terrible idea, which is why they didn't copy that model initially. But Singapore decided to plow ahead. The bet was massive as well, and the government invested hundreds of millions of dollars across 2 decades. For years, it looked like the bet would eventually pay off. Chartered went public in 1999 and was producing cutting-edge chips for Qualcomm, Infineon, AMD, and other global giants. And while Philip Yew was transforming Singapore's industrial DNA, another bold experiment was actually unfolding. In 1990, George Yeo saw the need to transform Singapore into a globally cultural city. Singapore had been known for banning chewing gum worldwide, not Broadway shows. He relaxed censorship rules, what he called pruning the banyan tree, so that there could be more space for local arts groups to grow. It is often said that non-fiction raises our floor of knowledge, and reading fiction raises our ceiling. George Yeo believed that this could also be said of the arts. He championed Singapore's bid to become a cultural node that could attract regional headquarters, international events, and high-value tourism, so that Singapore could be a lot more attractive for an emerging global creative class. He was also betting that art, design, and entertainment would become significant economic sectors, not just nice-to-haves. The centerpiece of this effort was the Esplanade, a world-class performing arts complex, initially mooted by Ong Teng Cheong. The uncertainty came about from both the financial risk of $600 million at the time, and critics fearing that the Esplanade would eventually become a white elephant. When the Ministry of Finance refused to fund it, he marshalled the necessary resources by getting the Tote Board to pay for it instead. And throughout this whole effort, if you really think about it, Singapore essentially went from a country that banned long hair and regulated pop music to one that actively subsidized theatre and contemporary arts. How crazy was that? So during the Goh Chok Tong era, instead of playing it safe, his team doubled down with even more audacious bets. We were not content with remaining a nation of technicians. We wanted to make breakthrough biomedical research, nurture our own local champions in semiconductor manufacturing, and have world-class performances in the Esplanade. How would the Hsien Loong era top that? Let's start with the first bet. In 2004, Hsien Loong pioneered a landmark pivot on casinos. He raised the issue during his first major national address after becoming Prime Minister, taking personal political risk by going against conservative social norms and strong public opposition. even against his own father. Kuan Yew had always strongly objected to such a move. Even during the parliamentary debate in 2005, he still stood by his views that casinos are a social evil. But he understood that global tourism was booming and Macau was emerging as a world-class resort destination. Macau was granting licenses to players other than Stanley Ho for the first time, ending his 40-year monopoly on the casino business. This invited the big guns like Sands, Wynn, and MGM to Macau. They built mega resorts and other spectacles, targeting mass market travelers, which is why Singapore felt that it needed to respond, not just by opening one, but two integrated resorts. The integrated resorts in Marina Bay Sands and Sentosa were meant to revitalize tourism, generate new jobs, and boost the service sector. When the government opened the integrated resorts in 2010, it coupled it with landmark events like the first global Formula 1 night race to establish Singapore as a dynamic and globally relevant city-state. Tourist arrivals rocketed to almost 12 million in 2010 from around 9 million in 2005, a 30% jump. An acquired but equally important shift in how Singapore deployed its financial resources was also unfolding. In 2004, the very year that Hsien Loong became Prime Minister, Ho Ching took over as CEO of Temasek Holdings, and over the next 2 decades, she would engineer a strategic transformation that reshaped Temasek. At the time that she took over, about 50% of Temasek's portfolio was domestic, invested in local banks, telcos, transport and energy firms. But by the time that she stepped down in 2021, that number had flipped. More than 70% of Temasek assets were now global. Its portfolio ballooned from $90 billion to about $400 billion in 2023 and 2024, becoming one of the most active and strategic sovereign wealth funds in the world. Unlike Norway's oil-backed passive fund, Temasek plays a double role, as both owner of Singapore's core national infrastructure, like Singtel, SP, and SMRT, and as well a builder of strategic positions in foreign markets. It built up Singaporean companies like Sembcorp, Seatrium, and Singapore Airlines into global operators, embedding them into global networks. This global expansion wasn't just for returns, it was also a bold act of economic statecraft, using capital to compensate for what Singapore lacked in land and population. Temasek also bought into China tech giants like Alibaba and Meituan, and into India's fintech and telco ecosystems. However, the Hsien Corp scandal in Thailand showed just how political this could potentially get. In 2006, Temasek acquired a controlling stake in Thailand's largest telecom provider, previously owned by then Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, triggering a public backlash so strong it played a role in the coup that eventually removed him from power. But that wasn't Singapore's intention. But it revealed how Temasek, even as a corporate actor in this case, can disrupt the domestic politics of neighbouring states. Temasek has since largely divested its shares, including by selling to its own subsidiary Singtel, which now owns about 25% of the renamed corporation. Along with the central bank, Temasek and GIC contribute to the budget of the government, with 50% of returns on assets or investment income. Combined, they make up about 20% of the government's yearly budget, almost double of GST revenue. While other countries as diverse as Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Norway similarly use their sovereign wealth funds to fund government budgets, the Norway fund provided 25% of the national budget in 2021. But Singapore is unique because the fund is not primarily capitalized by oil or gas revenues. And meanwhile, Singapore was doubling down on what it knew best with its next bet. The Tuas Megaport and Changi Terminal 5 are massive infrastructure projects designed to secure Singapore's status as a global transport hub well into the mid-21st century. We often forget how exceptional this is and how abnormal it is for a small city-state like Singapore to dominate in physical infrastructure. And no one else in the region has launched similar mega projects in response. Take the new Tuas Megaport, announced in 2012, that will cost over $20 billion. When fully completed in 2040s, it will be the largest fully automated container terminal in the world. It will handle 65 million TEUs per year, nearly double our existing ports at around 40 million TEUs annually. To put that in perspective, We have the highest port throughput per capita in the world. Container ships have grown massively in scale. Older terminals simply can't handle the new generation of ultra-large container vessels. Automation is key here. Global ports from Shanghai to Rotterdam are racing to integrate robotics, AI, and IoT systems to improve efficiency. Singapore's bet is to out-execute them. Similarly, Changi Terminal 5 is a $10 billion mega project announced in 2013. T5 alone will add 50 million passengers a year, lifting Changi's capacity from about 90 million to 135. Slated to be operational in the mid-2030s, it will be larger than all the 4 terminals combined. Why such a big bet post-COVID? It's actually a bet on the long arc of global mobility. Yes, the pandemic crushed air travel, but Singapore is looking past to a world where Asia's middle class surges by over 2 billion people by 2040, where cross-border movement accelerates and not decline. Whereas in comparison, Hong Kong's hub status has stalled. Despite its heavy reliance on international trade and travel, Hong Kong was one of the last destinations to reopen to the world, only fully lifting restrictions in the early 2030s. Hong Kong's leading airline, Cathay Pacific, solved mass resignation and pilot shortages because of strict COVID protocols and lockdowns. And we started to transform how the government supported our own people with its subsequent move. In 2007, Tharman Shanmugaratnam broke one of the unspoken rules in Singapore policy making by introducing the Workfare Income Supplement Scheme, or better known as WIS. For decades, Singapore had resisted welfare policies, fearing dependency and eroded self-reliance. Before WIS, help was largely piecemeal, in the form of training grants or job placements. WIS recognized that if someone was working full-time but still couldn't afford retirement or basic healthcare, the state had a role to play. It reframed state support as a co-investment with working individuals. That's what countries like the US and UK have been doing for decades, with the Earned Income Tax Credit or Universal Credit. These systems mostly paid out direct cash, helping with immediate consumption, but they didn't touch on long-term security. WIS pays out a portion of its support in cash, yes, but the majority actually goes directly into CPF and Medisave. And support programs in the US and UK often require constant means testing, self-reporting, and paperwork. Fraud and stigma are ongoing concerns. Whereas in Singapore, WIS is automatic. If you meet the income and age criteria, the money flows directly to the workers. When you take a step back and look across all 3 eras that we covered, you will notice that what has slowly changed is actually the type of bets Singapore is inclined to make. Look closely and you'll notice 2 distinct categories emerging. There are bold bets, high-risk ventures into completely new domains where we had no proven advantage up to that point, like Dr. Goh courting multinationals to set up manufacturing bases when our economy was oriented towards trade, or Philip Yew's attempts to push Singapore into the lead regionally across petrochemical, biomedical, and semiconductors. Then there are big bets, massive investments that still cost billions of dollars, but essentially doubling down on what already works. Tuas Megaport isn't revolutionary. It's saying that we are already the best at ports, but let's be even better. Terminal 5 isn't pioneering new aviation paradigms. It's betting that our air hub model survives the next 30 years. There's still risks, granted, but these risks are more calculated and external. For instance, whether the projected travel demand that we project for Terminal 5 materialize. These big bets are always necessary, but we must not lose the ability to continue making bold bets. But as we got richer, we've been making more big bets and less bold bets. Why? We could boil it down to 3 reasons. The accountability trap. As Singapore became more successful, our tolerance for failures of these bold bets started to diminish. Remember Chartered Semiconductors? The foundry business proved brutally competitive, requiring constant technological advancements and massive capital investments. CSM was unable to compete in the global semiconductor market because of the entrance on TSMC in Singapore, or withstand the emergence of Chinese semiconductors like SMIC. CSM was eventually sold off to Global Foundries, owned by Abu Dhabi in 2009, after the fall of the subprime mortgage financial crisis. So we incurred decades of losses, but this bold bet ended up failing. But this failed attempt did not raise massive electoral dissatisfaction, even if voters do not take kindly to that failure. But today, a venture losing money for even 5 years will likely face intense parliamentary scrutiny. Remember Philip Yeo's bet on Singapore's becoming a leading biomedical hub? For sure, we have been able to compete meaningfully in biomedical manufacturing. Yet, we have not really seen many breakthroughs in cutting-edge R&D and commercialization. For instance, Vonjo, a rare blood cancer drug, which was developed in Singapore, was sold off to a Swedish company because Singapore lacks the commercialization capabilities to navigate achieving FDA approval. The result? The Swedish company reaped the windfall, receiving 57 times what they paid the Singaporean company. Tesla Therapeutics also collapsed when the biotech funding environment dried up post-COVID-19. Even if they had survived, it remained to be seen if they would have succeeded, as their assets were in cell therapy, which was niche and facing scaling challenges. The major acquisition successes of KBP Biosciences have also since been embroiled in lawsuits with Novo Nordisk, the acquirer. On the flip side, Crovalimab was discovered at Chugai Pharma Body Research in Biopolis, crafted within a global corporate ecosystem, as Chugai is majority owned by Roche. Yet, public perceptions of Biopolis is already tilting towards negativity. So as Singapore became more successful, our tolerance for failures of these bold bets started to diminish. But let's consider a company like, let's say, Samsung. Their early Samsung electronics was so poorly designed and manufactured that if you leave their fans up with one hand, you actually broke it. And it was actually nicknamed Samsung instead. A slump in memory chip prices in 1997 to 1998 slashed Samsung's revenues and profits, dragging the company towards the brink of bankruptcy. Without state-backed loans, debt rollovers, and temporary financing facilities that the government provided, there will be no way it will be the global giant that it is today. But this creates a vicious cycle. Politicians start to avoid truly bold bets because voters punish failures more than they reward breakthroughs. Imagine if Hsien Loong's integrated resorts move had failed. He would have been known as the prime minister that went against his father's wishes and literally gambled the money on casinos. All this is compounded by the increasingly narrow margins of the ruling party in recent elections. We have seen vote percentages drop from the high 70s during Lee Kuan Yew's eras to the mid 60s during Hsien Loong's era, with the low point of 60.1% during the 2011 election. Older generations remember how Singapore defied the odds, going from third world to first. Their votes are shaped by memory. But for subsequent generations, their story feels distant. If you stop people on the streets, many won't be able to name the bold bets and the bold decisions that got us here, let alone feel emotionally invested in them. And it's not that the government hasn't tried to tell the story, nor is it that the younger generation simply doesn't care. But the message isn't landing. At the end of the day, it's about whether people feel that they are understood and can make a change. Most people's concerns these days are about the cost of living, and things feel a lot more expensive than they used to be because economic growth has progressively slowed down. Singapore got richer in recent years, yes, but the rest of the world is also becoming progressively richer and catching up. Whereas, what made Singapore a lot richer in the past is because the bold bets that we took generated a lot of economic payoff that made other things cheaper in comparison. This disconnect isn't just cultural, it becomes political. When voters no longer understand the costs and courage behind Singapore's success, they become more wary of risks. They see failure not as part of experimentation, but as misused funds that could have supported citizens with the high cost of living. This shift in risk tolerance ties the government's hands. Because while big bets and bold bets cost money, only one type can end political careers. So we reward the leadership that tend to make safer big bets that extend proven strategies rather than pioneer new ones. And the second reason is where things get dicey. Because when we stop taking bold bets, we also unknowingly give up much more. The expertise dilemma. In Japan, there's this practice of rebuilding the Issei shrine from scratch every 20 years. Not because it is breaking down or collapsing, but because it is built with so much craftsmanship that those skills must never be lost. There is tacit knowledge that simply can never be transmitted via speech or books. The same can be said here in Singapore. Could Chartered Semiconductor's failure be why it was the last major state-seeded industrial champion at scale? Since its sale in 2009 to Global Foundries, Singapore has shifted away from directly seeding national industrial champions. In refraining from seeding them, we will eventually lose the expertise and the willpower to start them in the future. And it brings up the question of whether we still have the capability to create them or revive fledgling ones. Take our 30 by 30 food security target, meant to boost local food production to 30% of nutritional needs by 2030. We created the Singapore Food Authority (SFA) in 2019, a government body, but we lack a single commercial champion to crack the most important consideration of all: commercial viability of a buy domestic for domestic food strategy. The only way to make local consumers want to buy local is if they are not paying a premium. People balking at increasing food costs will not want to shell out extra for local produce, unless Singapore is willing to continually lavish vast sums of subsidies to achieve this specific goal. I'm sure you heard of CP Foods, Thailand's largest food conglomerate. It is the embodiment of state-corporate symbiosis. They receive preferential land access and zoning, securing vast plots for feed mills, farms, processing facilities, often with state broker deals or concessional terms. This is not to mention cheaper sources of capital from domestic banks. The only solution to equalizing price disparity between local and foreign produce is either scale, technological advantage, or pure government subsidy. Imagine if we had a locally championed agri-tech equivalent of CP Foods. We will potentially be able to secure both scale and technological advances to keep local produce cheaper, or at least on par with foreign produce. Instead, responsibility has been splintered across SFA in terms of grants disbursement, local budding farms without outsized scale, fair price in terms of distribution and cash flow support for local farms, and scattered investments by Temasek in emerging agri-food technologies, which has led to policy diffusion and underwhelming execution, and is why we have seen the shuttering of a number of local farms which cannot compete on their own in the domestic market, like IFFI, a local indoor farm, or scaling back of ambition by Verti Veggies, which was supposed to increase local production of vegetables by 10%. Which brings us to the third reason: because losing our institutional building capabilities is only part of the problem, the frontier problem. There's another issue. As Singapore approaches the global frontier, bull bets becomes exponentially harder. We are playing catch-up with developed countries. You can essentially copy proven models and execute them better. Some of Singapore's early successes came from taking ideas that worked elsewhere and implementing them with superior efficiency. And we have done really well for ourselves. Singapore has one of the highest GDP per capita and life expectancy. But when you're already at the global frontier, there's no ready playbook to follow. And this isn't unique to Singapore. The European Union's GDP matched the US back in 2008. But since, even with all its resources, has seen a massive gap open up, with US GDP at $26.9 trillion and EU at $15 trillion in 2023. Because the EU has built institutions optimized for regulation and stability, not disruption and innovation. And in the US, a gridlock political system and cultural polarization now store public investments in bold long-term bets. Even America finds it harder to be the America that once started the Apollo project. And these three reasons are key, because without a shared understanding of how we got here, we also lose the public imagination needed to get somewhere new. Now with all of this said, what can we do to move Singapore into a new golden age? Recent policies have been focused on redistribution, to make sure that we don't forget the ones that have been left behind as Singapore got rich. But we must never forget that this must not come at the expense of aggressive growth policies. The two are not mutually exclusive. I will share two bold bets we can take to further spur growth. Let's start with the first. Singaporean students often enter the workforce only at age 23 to 25 years old, one of the latest amongst developed countries. By the time a Singaporean graduate starts their first job, their peers tend to have already clocked 2 to 4 years of real-world experience, sometimes even more. And the gap simply compounds, not just financially, but in confidence, exposure, and risk appetite. By 25, an American founder might already be on their second startup. A German technician could be managing a team. A Singaporean still figuring out what the working world is like. But if lifelong learning is truly the future, as SkillsFuture signals, then why are we front-loading all learning into the early years only to expect Singaporeans to upskill later in life? This is not just about educational reform, it's a bold bet on youth agency. We need to stop treating the first 2 decades of life like a bubble. We should be rethinking how early exposure works and get young Singaporeans into the arena sooner so that we can rewire their timeline of ambition. Because if you wait until 25 for people to figure it out, we've already lost a chunk of the window when some people take their biggest risks. Let's move on to the second bold bet idea. Just like how Singapore built specialist schools for sports and the arts, it's time to do the same for entrepreneurship. Because right now, Singapore is still treating entrepreneurs building successful businesses like a lottery. The entrepreneurs are just born and cannot ever be molded, something they just stumble into in their 20s and 30s after collecting enough credentials. But the truth is, the pathway to more entrepreneurship has already been proven out. Other countries have already understood this. The US has startup schools like Y Combinator that churn out companies like Airbnb and Twitch, and it has an unfair advantage where its culture celebrates founders, even ones that drop out. Israel channels its most ambitious minds into Unit 8200, the military unit behind some of the world's most valuable cybersecurity and data companies. And when other countries don't have the entrepreneurial streak in their culture, Estonia starts tech training at age 13. South Korea, despite having limited raw entertainment talent, it industrialized stardom through boot camps. They don't wait for idols to emerge organically. They train them relentlessly. Think an elite academy that combines engineering, business, product design, and storytelling. Y Combinator meets the Teal Fellowship, seated right here in Singapore. Singapore needs to stop waiting for entrepreneurs to self-assemble. If we want world-class entrepreneurs, we can't just hope that they'll figure it out on their own. We need to train them young, pressure test their ideas, teach them to build, to fail, to lead. Because startups aren't just companies, they are also vessels for national ambition. And here's the thing, what we should learn from all the bold bets that Singapore has taken across all the years is that even if the bold bets have mixed outcomes, or even if let's say they fail outright, they remain more than necessary. Because they prove that Singapore is still willing to compete at a global frontier. The choice ahead isn't whether Singapore should take risks, it's what kind of risks we are willing to take. Every successful country faces this exact moment. Just look at Britain or Japan. Singapore's edge was our our size or resources. It was our willingness to bet on futures others couldn't quite see yet. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Our competitors aren't standing still. Estonia is building digital government infrastructure we're still catching up to. Israel's startup ecosystem produces unicorns at 10 times our rate per capita. Even Dubai, once just copying our playbook, is now pioneering new models of economic zones and residency that challenges ours. The question isn't whether we can afford to take bold bets again, it's whether we can afford not to. Thank you for watching. I'm Hsien Loong, your host, and see you in the next video.